They slid a crayon drawing across the table toward me, and everyone burst into laughter. It was Emma's artwork from school, a stick figure princess with purple hair riding a rainbow dragon. But they weren't laughing with joy. They were laughing at me. "Look familiar, Maya?" My sister Jessica smirked, holding up the drawing like evidence in a court case. "Looks like your daughter inherited your fantasy gene. Maybe she can help you with your little cartoon business." The room erupted again. My father wiped tears from his eyes. My mother shook her head with that disappointed look I knew so well, and Jessica basked in the spotlight of their approval. But as I stared at Emma's drawing, this beautiful, imaginative world she'd created with nothing but crayons and hope, something crystallized in my chest. They saw fantasy. I saw vision. They saw childishness. I saw the exact kind of magic that would make Disney call me 18 months later, with an offer that would silence every laugh, every dismissive comment, every time they'd made me feel small for dreaming big. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Maya Chen, and I've spent most of my 32 years being the family disappointment. Not the dramatic kind that makes headlines or requires intervention, just the quiet, persistent kind that hangs in the air during family dinners like smoke from a forgotten candle. While my sister Jessica climbed corporate ladders in finance and collected achievements like trophies, I collected rejection letters from animation studios and paid my bills with freelance graphic design work that barely covered rent on my converted garage studio in Phoenix. The thing about being an animator in a family of accountants and real estate agents is that your entire existence feels like a foreign language they refuse to learn. When Jessica got her MBA, they threw a party. When I got my first paid animation gig for a local children's hospital, creating characters for their waiting room, my mother asked if I was finally ready to get serious about a real career. When Jessica bought her second investment property, they bragged to their friends about her business acumen. When I spent 3 years developing an animated series about a little girl who discovers magic in everyday objects, they asked when I was going to stop playing pretend and grow up. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family who constantly told me to abandon my dreams was the same family that rushed to Disney World every other summer, buying merchandise and taking photos with characters that someone like me had brought to life. But pointing that out only earned me eye rolls and lectures about the difference between enjoying entertainment and making a living from it. According to my parents, there were exactly 7 people in the world who could make money from animation, and I definitely wasn't one of them. Emma, my 6-year-old daughter, had become my unexpected ally in this war of artistic attrition. She didn't understand why Grandma Linda always frowned when she talked about the cartoons I was making, or why Uncle Jessica always changed the subject when Emma excitedly described the characters we'd developed together. What Emma understood was magic, possibility, and the way stories could transform ordinary moments into extraordinary adventures. She was my primary audience, my harshest critic, and my biggest cheerleader, all rolled into one tiny person who still believed that dragons could live in backyard gardens and that princesses came in every color of the rainbow. My workspace was a testament to both ambition and limitation. The converted garage behind our small apartment housed 2 computers I'd bought secondhand, a drawing tablet that I'd saved for 6 months to afford, and walls covered with concept art for Luna's Adventures, the animated series I'd been developing in every spare moment for the past 3 years. The main character, Luna, was inspired by Emma, a curious, brave little girl who discovered that ordinary objects held extraordinary magic when viewed through the right lens. A garden hose became a friendly dragon, sidewalk chalk transformed into portals to other worlds, and playground swings carried children to the clouds. It was everything my family dismissed as fantasy, and everything I believed animation could be at its best. The rejection letters from major studios had become wallpaper in my mind. Too whimsical for today's market. Not commercial enough. Doesn't fit our current content strategy. The feedback was always polite, always professional, and always devastating in the way that death by 1,000 paper cuts tends to be. But I kept creating because stopping felt like dying, and because Emma's face when she watched Luna's Adventures reminded me why stories mattered in the first place. My ex-husband Jake had been one of the first casualties of my commitment to what he called unrealistic expectations. 3 years into our marriage, right after Emma was born, he delivered an ultimatum disguised as concern. You need to choose reality, Maya. We have a daughter now. We can't both be dreamers. When I refused to abandon my animation work to focus solely on more stable graphic design projects, he packed his practical sensibilities and moved back to Denver with his practical new girlfriend who had a practical job in insurance. The divorce papers cited irreconcilable differences, but I knew the real reason was my refusal to apologize for believing in something he couldn't see. The financial struggle was real and constant. Freelance graphic design work paid the bills, barely, but left little time or energy for the animation projects that fed my soul. I took on logo designs for local businesses, created marketing materials for real estate companies, and designed wedding invitations for couples who had the luxury of planning celebrations instead of calculating whether they could afford both groceries and art supplies in the same week. Every commercial project was a small betrayal of my artistic vision, but also a step closer to financial stability for Emma. My family's concern about my career choices would have been touching if it hadn't been so consistently undermining. They never asked about my work with genuine curiosity, never inquired about my progress on personal projects, and never acknowledged the small victories that kept me going. When I won a local art contest for character design, my mother's response was to ask if there had been prize money. When I was featured in a regional magazine article about local artists pursuing their passions, my father clipped it out and mailed it to me with a note that said, "Nice hobby piece, sweetheart." Their love was conditional on my success being the kind they could understand and measure. The worst part wasn't the lack of support, though that stung daily. The worst part was how their constant dismissal had begun to creep into my own internal dialogue. Late at night, after Emma was asleep and I was alone with my sketches and storylines, their voices would echo in my head. Who do you think you are? What makes you special? Why do you think you can compete with real studios? The questions multiplied in the darkness, feeding on exhaustion and financial stress until some nights I wondered if they were right. Maybe I was living in Fantasyland. Maybe it was time to grow up. But then morning would come and Emma would bounce into my studio asking if Luna had any new adventures, and I'd remember why I started this journey in the first place. Animation wasn't just my dream, it was my language, my way of translating the magic I saw in the world into something others could experience. Every frame I drew, every character I developed, every story I crafted was an act of rebellion against a world that insisted magic was only for children, and dreamers were just adults who refused to face reality. The family gatherings were where the dismissal felt most acute, surrounded by Jessica's professional achievements and my parents' obvious pride in their successful daughter. Christmas dinners and birthday parties became performance reviews where I was always found lacking. Jessica would discuss her latest real estate investments while I talked about my latest client projects, never mentioning the animation work that consumed my heart and my evenings. The conversations felt like walking through a minefield where any mention of my true passions would trigger explosions of concern disguised as practical advice. But Emma's 6th birthday party, held at my parents' house in Scottsdale, was about to become the moment when everything changed. Not because my family finally understood my work, but because their mockery would become so blatant, so deliberately cruel, that it would crystallize something inside me I didn't know existed. The moment when their laughter at my daughter's imagination would transform from painful background noise into rocket fuel for the most focused 18 months of my life. As I sat in their perfectly appointed living room watching Emma carefully arrange her art supplies on the coffee table preparing to show her grandparents the drawings she'd made of Luna's latest adventure, I had no idea that this afternoon would mark the end of seeking their approval and the beginning of creating something that would make their validation irrelevant. I thought I was attending a birthday party. Instead, I was about to attend my own artistic awakening. In my family, I've always been Maya the impractical one, Maya the dreamer, Maya who can't seem to get her life together despite being 32 years old with a college degree and actual talent. I'm not Maya the artist or Maya the creative visionary, or even Maya the single mother doing her best. I'm just Maya who still believes in fairy tales, according to my mother's introductions at neighborhood barbecues. Growing up as the younger sister of Jessica Chen meant growing up in a shadow that had its own zip code. Jessica was the golden child before she could walk, the kind of baby who slept through the night and never spit up on expensive clothes. She was valedictorian in high school, summa cum laude in college, and had her 5-year plan mapped out before most people figured out what they wanted for lunch. I was the child who colored outside the lines, literally and metaphorically, who asked too many questions about why the sky couldn't be purple, and why princesses always had to be rescued instead of doing the rescuing themselves. My parents, Linda and Robert Chen, immigrated from Taiwan when Jessica was 2 and I was still a distant possibility. They carried with them the weight of sacrifice and the absolute certainty that their daughters would justify every hardship they'd endured to build a life in America. Success in their vocabulary was measurable, tangible, and came with health insurance. Jessica delivered on every expectation they'd held, while I seemed determined to challenge every assumption they'd made about what their American dream should look like. Linda worked as a nurse for 30 years, saving money with the discipline of someone who remembered what it meant to have nothing. Robert built a small but successful accounting firm, helping other immigrant families navigate tax codes and business regulations. Together, they created a life of careful stability, where every decision was weighed against practical outcomes and every dollar was allocated with precision. Into this world of measured success, I arrived with my head full of stories and my hands covered in paint, asking if we could redecorate my bedroom to look like an enchanted forest. The differences between Jessica and me weren't subtle. She played piano with technical perfection while I made up songs about the adventures of dust motes dancing in sunbeams. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She excelled at mathematics while I doodled characters in the margins of my homework, creating elaborate backstories for geometric shapes. She saved her allowance while I spent mine on art supplies and books about animation techniques. By high school, the contrast was so stark that family friends would joke about how we must have been switched at birth. Except, the jokes always carried an undertone that suggested Jessica was clearly the right child while I was some sort of cosmic mistake. College was supposed to be my redemption arc. My parents had reluctantly agreed to let me major in art, but only if I double majored in something practical. So I spent 4 years splitting my attention between animation courses that set my soul on fire and business classes that felt like wearing shoes 2 sizes too small. I graduated with decent grades in both majors and absolutely no doubt about which path I wanted to follow, much to my family's dismay. Jessica, meanwhile, had graduated with her MBA and immediately landed a position at a prestigious consulting firm in San Francisco. Within 2 years, she was making more money than both our parents combined, buying investment properties and dating a surgeon who drove a Tesla and wore watches that cost more than my annual rent. Every family dinner became an informal progress report on Jessica's ascending trajectory, while my updates about freelance design work and animation projects were met with polite nods and strategic subject changes. Meeting Jake during my senior year felt like finding someone who understood the artistic soul that my family seemed determined to overlook. He was a photographer with dreams of documenting social justice issues, and we bonded over late-night conversations about the power of visual storytelling to change the world. He encouraged my animation ambitions, spent hours watching me work on character designs, and talked about the day when we'd both be successful artists who could travel the world creating meaningful work together. The proposal came 6 months after graduation, right as I was starting to build a small client base for freelance animation work. Jake presented it as a practical decision wrapped in romantic packaging. We could split living expenses, support each other's artistic pursuits, and build the creative life we'd dreamed about during those late-night college conversations. I said yes because I loved him, but also because I was tired of feeling like the only person in my family who believed in impractical dreams. Marriage to Jake meant moving to Phoenix, where the cost of living was lower, and we could afford a small apartment with space for both a darkroom and an animation studio. My parents attended the wedding with smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes, and Jessica gave a maid of honor speech about how marriage would help me settle down and find direction. The early months were blissful in the way that only comes from feeling understood for the first time in your life. But understanding someone's dreams and supporting them through the daily grind of pursuing those dreams turned out to be entirely different challenges. Jake's photography work was sporadic, and my animation projects paid even less consistently. We survived on my freelance graphic design work, which paid the bills but left little time for the creative projects that had brought us together. The stress of financial instability began to erode the romantic notion of being starving artists, and Jake's encouragement gradually transformed into concern about our future. When I discovered I was pregnant during our second year of marriage, Jake's response was telling. Instead of excitement about bringing a child into our creative household, he immediately started talking about responsibility, stability, and the need to, quote, get serious about our careers. The pregnancy was unplanned, but not unwanted, at least not by me. Jake spent the 9 months oscillating between anticipation and anxiety, often in the same conversation. Emma arrived like a burst of sunlight into our increasingly complicated world. She was perfect in ways that made every hardship feel worthwhile, and from the moment I held her, I understood that love could be both fierce and gentle simultaneously. Jake was a devoted father in those early months, but I could see him calculating the cost of diapers against the uncertain income from artistic pursuits. The practical concerns that had always lurked beneath our bohemian lifestyle suddenly had a small, urgent face. My parents' reaction to becoming grandparents was complicated by their ongoing concern about our financial stability. They loved Emma immediately and completely, but their affection came wrapped in pointed observations about the challenges of raising children on irregular income. Linda would visit with bags of baby supplies and subtle comments about how much easier parenting would be if we had steady jobs with benefits. Robert set up a savings account for Emma's education and regularly mentioned the importance of providing security for the next generation. Jessica, now an aunt, approached Emma with the same efficiency she brought to everything else in her life. She researched the best developmental toys, created spreadsheets comparing preschool options, and gave us practical gifts that addressed real needs, while somehow making me feel inadequate for not having thought of them myself. Her love for Emma was genuine, but it came with an undertone of judgment about our lifestyle choices that made family gatherings increasingly tense. The breaking point in my marriage came when Emma was 18 months old, and I was offered a small contract to create animated content for a children's educational website. The pay was modest, but it was my first real animation work since her birth, and I was desperate to reconnect with the creative passion that motherhood had temporarily overshadowed. Jake's response was swift and unequivocal. We couldn't afford for me to take time away from higher-paying graphic design work to pursue what he now called hobby projects. The argument that followed revealed the fault lines that had been developing in our relationship since Emma's birth. Jake accused me of being selfish and unrealistic, of prioritizing my artistic fantasies over our family's financial security. I accused him of abandoning the dreams that had brought us together, of becoming exactly the kind of person we used to mock for choosing comfort over creativity. We both said things that couldn't be unsaid, and by the end of the night we were sleeping in separate rooms and speaking only about Emma's immediate needs. The divorce proceedings were mercifully brief, conducted with the efficiency of two people who had run out of things to fight about. Jake moved back to Denver, where his parents helped him start a commercial photography business specializing in corporate headshots and real estate listings. He sent child support payments with military precision and called Emma every Sunday, but the man who had once encouraged my wildest creative ambitions had transformed into someone who measured success exclusively in terms of financial stability. Becoming a single mother meant becoming the sole provider for Emma, while also being her primary caregiver, educator, and emotional support system. The freelance graphic design work that had supplemented our income suddenly became my lifeline, and I took on projects I would have refused when I had the luxury of artistic integrity. I designed logos for companies I didn't believe in, created marketing materials for products I didn't use, and spent my days bringing other people's visions to life, while my own artistic dreams gathered dust in the converted garage that served as my studio. My family's reaction to the divorce was predictably complicated. They expressed appropriate sympathy while barely concealing their relief that I might finally abandon what they saw as unrealistic artistic pursuits. Linda offered to babysit Emma while I focused on building a more stable client base, and Robert suggested I consider returning to school for an MBA like Jessica's. Their support came with conditions and expectations that felt more suffocating than helpful. The loneliness of single motherhood was amplified by the isolation of being an artist in a family that didn't understand art. I would spend days speaking only to Emma and my clients, creating work that paid the bills but didn't feed my soul. The animation projects that had once energized me became luxury items I couldn't afford, pushed to evenings when Emma was asleep, and I was too exhausted to think clearly. But Emma was also my salvation during those difficult months. She saw magic in everything, just like I had at her age, and her enthusiasm for the stories I told her reminded me why I had fallen in love with animation in the first place. She would sit in my studio while I worked on commercial projects, drawing her own pictures and asking endless questions about how cartoons came to life. Her curiosity was infectious, and slowly, I began to find ways to incorporate small creative elements into even the most mundane client work. The idea for Luna's Adventures emerged from one of our bedtime conversations, when Emma asked me to tell her a story about a little girl who could see magic that grown-ups couldn't see. As I spun tales about Luna discovering that garden hoses were actually sleeping dragons, and that playground swings were secret portals to cloud kingdoms, I realized I was describing the worldview I had always carried, but had learned to hide from practical adults who insisted on realistic expectations. Creating Luna became my secret rebellion against the life I was supposed to want. After Emma fell asleep, I would return to my studio and translate our bedtime stories into character designs, storyboards, and eventually short animated sequences. The work was painstakingly slow, completed in stolen moments between client projects and household responsibilities, but it felt like reclaiming a part of myself that I had almost forgotten existed. My family knew about the Luna project in the vague way that people know about hobbies they don't particularly understand or approve of. When they asked about my work, I talked about my graphic design clients and mentioned the animation as a side project that kept me creative. Their responses were always polite but dismissive, the conversational equivalent of patting me on the head and suggesting I focus on more important things. Jessica, in particular, had perfected the art of supportive dismissal. She would listen to my updates about Luna's latest adventure with the patient expression of someone humoring a child's imaginary friend. "That's nice, Maya," she would say, before transitioning to discussions of her latest real estate acquisition or business trip. Her success had become so towering that my creative pursuits felt like finger painting next to her corporate achievements. The financial stress of supporting Emma alone while trying to maintain my artistic integrity created a constant tension that colored every decision I made. I would stand in grocery stores calculating whether I could afford both fresh fruit and new art supplies, choosing between Emma's immediate needs and my long-term creative goals. The guilt of those calculations was overwhelming, but I also knew that abandoning my artistic dreams entirely would mean modeling for Emma a life where practical concerns always trumped personal passion. My parents' concern for our financial stability was genuine, but often felt more like judgment than support. They would offer to help with expenses, while simultaneously questioning why I couldn't simply focus on more lucrative graphic design work. Their offers came with implicit expectations about the kind of life I should be building, and accepting their help felt like admitting that my artistic pursuits were indeed the impractical fantasies they had always believed them to be. The converted garage studio became my sanctuary and my prison simultaneously. It was the space where Luna came to life frame by painstaking frame, but it was also a constant reminder of how far I was from the professional animation career I had imagined during college. The equipment was secondhand, the space was cramped, and the isolation was profound. But it was mine. And on the best days, when Emma would sit beside me drawing her own characters while I worked on Luna's world, it felt like the center of everything that mattered. 3 years into developing Luna's Adventures, I had created enough content to fill several episodes of what could become a children's series. The characters were fully developed, the world was richly imagined, and the stories addressed themes of curiosity, creativity, and the magic of seeing ordinary things in extraordinary ways. But I had no clear path toward turning this passion project into anything that resembled a career, and my family's increasing concern about my financial situation was beginning to erode my confidence in the project's potential. The rejection letters from animation studios had become a familiar rhythm of hope and disappointment. Each submission represented months of work distilled into a pitch package that would be politely declined with form letters praising the creativity while explaining that the content didn't fit current market demands. The feedback was never specific enough to guide improvements, just general enough to suggest that my vision didn't align with commercial viability. But I kept creating because stopping felt like betraying not just my own dreams but also Emma's imagination. She believed in Luna's world with the absolute faith that only children possess, and her enthusiasm reminded me daily that magic was real if you knew how to look for it. Every evening, as I tucked her into bed and she asked for another Luna story, I was reminded that the work mattered beyond commercial success or family approval. The woman I had become by Emma's 6th birthday was someone I barely recognized from my college days. I was stronger in some ways, more resilient and focused than I had ever been when my biggest concern was choosing between art and business classes. But I was also more isolated, more financially stressed, and more aware of how my family saw me as someone who couldn't quite get her life together despite being intelligent and talented. As Emma's birthday approached, I was determined to make it special, despite our limited budget. I had planned a small celebration at my parents' house, where she could show off the Luna drawings she had been working on for weeks, and where I hoped, perhaps naively, that my family might finally see the magic that she and I shared in those characters and stories. I had no idea that the afternoon would become the catalyst for everything that followed, or that their mockery would transform from painful background noise into the fuel for the most focused creative period of my life. The pattern of dismissal. The signs were always there, woven so seamlessly into the fabric of our family interactions that I mistook them for normal, until Emma started asking questions I couldn't answer. Why did Grandma Linda always change the subject when I talked about my animation work? Why did Uncle Jessica's eyes glaze over when Emma described Luna's latest adventures? Why did family celebrations always feel like performance reviews where my work was consistently rated as inadequate? The pattern had roots that stretched back to childhood, when my crayon drawings were met with practical suggestions about staying inside the lines, while Jessica's perfectly executed homework assignments earned spots on the refrigerator. My parents weren't cruel, just pragmatic people who had sacrificed everything for stability and couldn't understand why their daughter would voluntarily choose uncertainty when security was available. In elementary school, while other parents attended art shows and cheered for their children's creative efforts, mine attended parent-teacher conferences armed with questions about my academic performance in important subjects. When Mrs. Rodriguez, my third-grade teacher, suggested I might have artistic talent worth nurturing, my mother's response was to enroll me in additional math tutoring to balance out my education. The message was clear: creativity was acceptable as a hobby, but it shouldn't interfere with serious learning. High school brought more sophisticated forms of dismissal. When I won the regional art competition during my junior year, beating out students from schools with much better art programs, my parents' response was to ask whether the prize included scholarship money. When I didn't make the honor roll that same semester because I had been spending time on my winning submission instead of studying for calculus, they suggested I might need to prioritize better if I wanted to get into a good college. Jessica, meanwhile, was accumulating academic achievements like a collector hoarding precious items. National Honor Society, debate team captain, early admission to her first-choice university. Every family dinner became an opportunity for my parents to bask in her reflected glory while I sat quietly, knowing that any mention of my artistic pursuits would be met with polite interest followed by strategic redirection toward more important topics. College provided temporary relief from the family pattern, surrounded as I was by other students who understood that art wasn't just decoration, but communication, storytelling, and emotional connection. My professors encouraged experimental thinking and celebrated creative risk-taking in ways that felt revolutionary after 18 years of being told to color inside the lines. But even then, the double major requirement served as a constant reminder that my family's support was conditional on my maintaining practical alternatives to artistic dreams. The pattern intensified after graduation, when Jessica's rapid professional success provided a stark contrast to my uncertain creative trajectory. Family gatherings became informal competitions, where Jessica's achievements cast shadows that made my freelance work seem insignificant by comparison. She would discuss million-dollar real estate deals while I talked about designing logos for local coffee shops, and the disparity felt enormous even when my clients were genuinely satisfied with my work. Marriage to Jake temporarily disrupted the family pattern because he shared my creative aspirations and could speak the language of artistic ambition that my family had never learned. For a brief period, I had an ally who could translate my work into terms that sounded legitimate to practical ears. Jake would describe my animation projects with enthusiasm and authority that commanded respect in ways my own explanations never had. But his eventual capitulation to practical concerns felt like a betrayal that went beyond personal disappointment to validate my family's long-held skepticism about artistic careers. Motherhood added new dimensions to the dismissal pattern. Now, my creative pursuits weren't just impractical for me, they were potentially harmful to Emma's future security. My mother would hold her granddaughter while making pointed observations about the importance of providing stable homes for children. My father would play with Emma while mentioning how much college would cost and how crucial it was to start saving immediately. Their love for Emma was genuine, but it came packaged with implicit criticism of my ability to provide for her through artistic work. The rejection letters from animation studios became ammunition for family concerns disguised as support. Each declined submission was met with sympathetic noises, followed by suggestions that perhaps it was time to consider more reliable career paths. The practical advice was always delivered with love, but it carried an undertone of "we told you so" that made each professional disappointment feel like personal failure. Jessica's approach to my creative work was perhaps the most painful because it was wrapped in genuine affection. She would listen to my updates about Luna's adventures with the patient attention of someone indulging a beloved sister's harmless obsession. She would ask follow-up questions that demonstrated she had been listening, but her interest felt clinical rather than enthusiastic, like a therapist helping a patient work through delusions rather than a sister celebrating another sister's achievements. The financial struggles of single motherhood provided my family with concrete evidence that their concerns about my career choices had been justified. When I had to turn down Emma's request for new art supplies because we needed the money for groceries, Linda would offer to buy them while mentioning how much easier life would be if I had a steady paycheck. When I had to work late on a rushed client project and couldn't attend Emma's school performance, Robert would volunteer to go in my place while noting that traditional jobs came with more predictable schedules. The well-meaning advice escalated after my divorce, when my family's concern for Emma's stability overcame their usual diplomatic approach to my career choices. Linda suggested I consider returning to school for a teaching certificate, explaining that education was a noble profession that would provide summers off to spend with Emma. Robert offered to connect me with clients who might need full-time graphic designers, emphasizing the benefits of employer-provided health insurance. Jessica researched MBA programs that offered evening classes for working mothers, presenting the information as a thoughtful gift rather than pointed criticism. But the most insidious aspect of the dismissal pattern was how it had begun to infiltrate my own thinking. After years of having my artistic ambitions treated as charming but impractical fantasies, I had internalized the doubt that my family projected. Late at night, as I worked on Luna's character development while calculating whether we could afford both rent and art supplies, their voices would echo in my mind with devastating clarity. Who do you think you are? What makes you believe you're special enough to succeed where so many others have failed? How can you justify pursuing dreams when your daughter needs security? The pattern was most visible during family celebrations, when my updates about freelance work were met with polite interest that lasted exactly long enough to transition to Jessica's latest business triumph. Birthday dinners and holiday gatherings became exercises in endurance, where I would smile through conversations about real estate investments and corporate promotions, while my own professional life was treated as intermission entertainment between more important subjects. Emma's growing awareness of the family dynamics added a heartbreaking dimension to the dismissal pattern. She began to notice that her enthusiasm for Luna's adventures wasn't shared by her grandparents and aunt, and she started asking questions I couldn't answer without either lying or criticizing people she loved. Why didn't Grandma want to see her Luna drawings? Why did Uncle Jessica always check her phone when Emma told Luna stories? Why did family parties feel different when Mama talked about her work? The pattern reached its most sophisticated form when my family learned to couch their dismissal in language that sounded supportive while delivering the same underlying message. They would praise my creativity while questioning its commercial viability. They would express admiration for my persistence while wondering aloud whether it might be time to try a different approach. They would celebrate my artistic achievements while suggesting that perhaps it was time to consider how those skills might translate to more stable career opportunities. By the time Emma turned 6, The pattern of dismissal had become so normalized that I barely registered its presence. My family's response to my work had been consistent for so long that I had stopped expecting anything different. I would share updates about Luna's development or successful client projects, with the resigned awareness that they would be received as pleasant but ultimately insignificant news, like updates about a neighbor's garden or a distant relative's vacation. The tragedy of the pattern wasn't its cruelty, which was largely unintentional, but its effectiveness. After years of having my artistic ambitions treated as evidence of impracticality rather than vision, I had begun to doubt not just my commercial prospects but the value of the work itself. The stories that filled Emma with wonder and brought joy to my own heart felt increasingly like self-indulgent fantasies when viewed through my family's eyes. The characters I had lovingly developed over months of careful work seemed childish when described to people who measured success in terms of quarterly earnings and professional advancement. But the pattern also contained the seeds of its own destruction. Every dismissive comment, every strategic subject change, every piece of well-meaning advice about pursuing more practical goals was building toward a moment when I would finally stop seeking approval from people who couldn't see what I was creating. The pattern that had sustained itself through decades of small erosions was about to encounter something that would shatter it entirely. The moment when their dismissal became so blatant, so deliberately cruel, that it would transform from discouragement into rocket fuel for the most focused creative period of my life. Emma's 6th birthday party would mark the end of the pattern not because my family finally understood my work, but because their mockery would become so pronounced that I would stop caring whether they understood it. The afternoon that began with hope for connection would end with the crystal-clear realization that seeking their approval was like trying to convince colorblind people to appreciate a rainbow. Some people simply cannot see what you're creating, and their blindness says nothing about the beauty of your vision. The hidden contributions. What my family never saw were the 4 a.m. animation sessions that happened after Emma fell asleep and before she woke up, when the world was quiet enough for Luna's world to come alive on my computer screen. They never saw the grocery store calculations where I chose generic cereal over name brand so I could afford the software subscription that kept my animation program running. They never saw the client meetings where I smiled through requests for logo designs that made my soul ache while thinking about the character development scenes I would work on later that night. The hidden contributions weren't just about time and money, though both were sacrificed daily on the altar of artistic ambition. They were about emotional labor that went unrecognized and physical exhaustion that went unacknowledged. While my family worried about my lack of practical career focus, I was building a creative empire one frame at a time, funding it with commercial work that paid the bills, while slowly draining the artistic enthusiasm that made the personal projects possible. My graphic design client base had evolved into a carefully curated collection of projects that maximized income while minimizing creative compromise. I designed wedding invitations for couples planning celebrations I couldn't afford to throw for myself. I created marketing materials for restaurants where Emma and I couldn't afford to eat. I developed branding packages for small businesses whose owners made more in a month than I made in 6. All while maintaining the professional cheerfulness that kept clients happy and checks coming. The wedding invitation work was particularly lucrative because brides were willing to pay premium prices for custom designs that captured their romantic visions. I would spend hours listening to stories about fairy tale proposals and dream ceremonies, while creating visual representations of love stories that reminded me daily of my own marriage's failure. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was bringing other people's happy endings to life while my own love story had collapsed under the weight of practical concerns and artistic ambitions. Restaurant branding required a different kind of creative flexibility. I would research cuisine types I had never tasted, create visual identities for establishments I would never visit, and develop marketing strategies for businesses that existed in a different economic universe from my own. The work was steady and well paid, but it required me to inhabit lifestyles I couldn't afford, while maintaining enthusiasm for luxury experiences that were entirely theoretical in my own life. Corporate clients provided the most reliable income but demanded the greatest creative sacrifice. I designed annual reports for companies whose missions I didn't understand, created presentations for executives whose salaries exceeded my annual income, and developed visual communications for industries that felt completely foreign to someone who spent her evenings bringing cartoon dragons to life. The work was professionally satisfying in the way that successfully solving puzzles can be, but it left me creatively exhausted in ways that made my personal projects feel like climbing mountains after running marathons. The time management required to balance commercial work with Luna's development would have impressed efficiency experts if they had been tracking my schedule. I worked on client projects during Emma's school hours, handled administrative tasks during her afternoon cartoons, and dove into animation work after her bedtime. Weekends were carefully divided between family time and creative time, with Emma often sitting beside me in the studio drawing her own characters while I worked on Luna's latest adventure. The financial juggling act that funded both our daily life and my artistic pursuits required constant creativity that would have made accountants weep. I had separate savings accounts for different purposes: one for Emma's education, one for emergency expenses, one for equipment upgrades, and one for the art supplies that kept Luna's world expanding. Every client payment was immediately allocated across these different priorities, with artistic pursuits receiving whatever remained after practical needs were met. My family's assumption that I was simply disorganized or impractical stemmed from their inability to see the complex systems that made our life function. They saw the converted garage studio and assumed it was a hobbyist's playroom rather than a carefully organized production facility where professional quality work was created with equipment that had been saved for, researched, and purchased, with the precision of someone who couldn't afford mistakes. The equipment in my studio represented months of research and careful financial planning that my family never witnessed. The drawing tablet that enabled Luna's smooth animation had been purchased after 3 months of comparing specifications and prices, reading reviews, and saving money by taking on extra client projects. The computer that rendered Emma's favorite scenes had been assembled from components I had researched for weeks, balancing performance needs against budget constraints with the intensity of someone whose creative dreams depended on making the right technical decisions. Software subscriptions were another hidden expense that my family couldn't see, but that consumed a significant portion of my monthly budget. Professional animation programs cost more per month than our grocery budget, and the cloud storage needed to back up years of creative work required ongoing payments that competed with Emma's activity fees and my own basic needs. Every month, I had to choose between upgrading our internet speed and buying Emma new clothes, between maintaining professional software access and taking her to movies. The education that supported both my commercial work and personal projects was an ongoing investment that happened in stolen moments throughout each day. I watched animation tutorials during lunch breaks, read industry blogs while Emma did homework, and studied character development techniques during the brief windows of time between finishing client work and starting dinner preparation. Professional development courses were taken online during evening hours, after Emma was asleep, but before I was too exhausted to absorb new information. Networking within the animation community required creative approaches that worked around single motherhood constraints. Industry events were attended virtually when possible. Professional relationships were maintained through social media interactions during Emma's screen time, and portfolio development happened during weekend mornings while she played independently. The isolation of working from home meant that building professional connections required deliberate effort that had to be scheduled around parenting responsibilities. The emotional labor of maintaining optimism while facing constant rejection was perhaps the most exhausting hidden contribution. Every animation studio rejection letter arrived like a small death, requiring hours of emotional recovery while maintaining enthusiasm for Emma's questions about Luna's next adventure. Client feedback that suggested major revisions to projects I had spent weeks perfecting had to be absorbed professionally while internally questioning whether I was truly talented enough to succeed in either commercial or artistic endeavors. My family's concern about our financial stability was based on incomplete information about both our expenses and my earning potential. They saw the modest apartment and secondhand furniture while missing the careful budgeting that ensured Emma's needs were always met and artistic dreams remained funded. They worried about my irregular income while failing to recognize that my client base was steadily growing and my rates were increasing as my reputation for quality work spread through word-of-mouth recommendations. The sacrifices I made for Luna's development were largely invisible to people who didn't understand the animation process. Each 5-minute episode represented dozens of hours of work, spread across weeks of late-night sessions. Character development that looked simple on screen required extensive research into child psychology, folklore, and storytelling techniques that I pursued during every spare moment. The seemingly effortless magic of Luna's world was built on foundations of technical skill and creative discipline that took years to develop. Social sacrifices were another hidden cost that my family couldn't see because they involved relationships I didn't pursue rather than activities I couldn't afford. Dating was nearly impossible when evenings were devoted to animation work and weekends were carefully balanced between Emma time and creative time. Friendships required maintenance that I couldn't provide when every social invitation had to be weighed against project deadlines and financial constraints. The loneliness of being a single mother pursuing artistic dreams was compounded by the isolation of working in a field where most networking happened through industry events I couldn't attend. Emma's awareness of our financial constraints was carefully managed to preserve her childhood wonder, while ensuring she understood the value of money and the importance of artistic work. She knew that we made choices about spending because animation supplies were important for Mama's work, but she didn't know that those choices sometimes meant I skipped meals to ensure she had everything she needed. She understood that our apartment was smaller than Uncle Jessica's house because we spent money on creative things instead of fancy furniture, but she didn't understand that the creative things were an investment in a future that might never materialize. The health costs of working 18-hour days while maintaining emotional availability for a 6-year-old were beginning to accumulate in ways that concerned me, but that I kept hidden from my family. Chronic back pain from hunching over drawing tablets, eye strain from staring at computer screens, and stress-related insomnia were the physical manifestations of a lifestyle that demanded more energy than one person could sustainably provide. But addressing these health issues would require time and money that were already allocated to Emma's needs and Luna's development. My family's suggestion that I should focus entirely on more lucrative graphic design work revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how creative careers actually function. The commercial work that paid our bills was only possible because of the artistic skills I developed through personal projects. Luna's adventures wasn't a distraction from real work. It was the laboratory where I experimented with techniques, developed my unique style, and pushed creative boundaries that made my commercial work distinctive and valuable. The professional reputation I was building through client work was enhanced by the passion projects that demonstrated my range and creativity. Potential clients were often more interested in hiring someone who could bring original thinking to their projects than someone who could simply execute technical tasks competently. The animation work that my family saw as impractical fantasy was actually the foundation of everything that made my commercial work successful and financially sustainable. But perhaps the most significant hidden contribution was the modeling I was doing for Emma about the relationship between work and passion. While my family worried that I was teaching her to prioritize dreams over security, I was actually demonstrating that meaningful work required both practical skills and creative vision. She was learning that financial responsibility didn't have to mean abandoning artistic ambitions, that compromise didn't have to mean capitulation, and that sometimes the most important work happened in the quiet hours when nobody else was watching. Emma's 6th birthday would reveal just how much my family had missed about the foundation I had been building while they focused on the surface instability they found so concerning. The afternoon that began with their mockery of her innocent artistic enthusiasm would end with my decision to stop hiding the true scope of what I had been creating. They had been so focused on what they saw as my failure to build a traditional career that they had completely missed the unconventional empire. I was constructing one late-night animation session at a time. The invisible struggle. The alarm clock that woke me at 4 a.m. wasn't set for Emma or for household responsibilities. It was set for the 2 hours of complete silence that existed before my daughter woke up and the client emails started arriving, the only time when Luna's world could come alive without interruption. Those pre-dawn sessions were sacred creative time, purchased with sleep deprivation, that my family couldn't see but that accumulated in the dark circles under my eyes and the exhaustion that seemed to live in my bones. Working 18-hour days while maintaining the energy that motherhood demanded required a delicate balance that felt like walking a tightrope over a canyon. Emma needed a mother who could listen to her stories, help with homework, and engage with her boundless enthusiasm for life. My clients needed a designer who could deliver quality work on deadline while maintaining professional communication that never revealed the chaos happening behind the scenes. Luna's adventures needed a creator who could maintain artistic vision while pushing through technical challenges that sometimes felt insurmountable. The financial stress was a constant background hum that colored every decision, from morning coffee to bedtime stories. I would stand in Target calculating whether Emma needed new jeans more than I needed the drawing stylus that would make character animation more precise. I would choose between upgrading our internet speed to handle larger animation files and signing Emma up for the art classes she desperately wanted to take. Every purchase required weighing immediate needs against long-term creative goals, and the mental energy spent on these calculations was exhausting in ways that went far beyond simple budgeting. Sleep became a luxury that competed with creative productivity and client deadlines. I would return to my studio with lukewarm coffee, and the hope that inspiration would strike before exhaustion made creative work impossible. The computer screen became my companion during those midnight hours, when the world was quiet enough for artistic magic to happen. But my eyes burned and my shoulders ached from hunching over drawing tablets that had been purchased secondhand because new equipment wasn't in the budget. The isolation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of pursuing creative dreams while raising a child alone. Emma was wonderful company, but 6-year-olds couldn't provide the professional feedback or emotional support that sustained artistic ambition through difficult periods. Adult conversation was limited to client phone calls and brief exchanges with other parents during school pickup, leaving me starving for the kind of creative collaboration that had nourished my artistic development during college years. Emma's questions about why I worked so much were heartbreaking in their innocent directness. She would ask why I couldn't just watch cartoons with her instead of making them, why I seemed tired even after sleeping, why we couldn't take vacations like her classmates' families. Her observations cut straight to the core of my internal conflicts about whether pursuing artistic dreams was selfish, when it meant Emma had to share her mother's attention with imaginary characters who might never earn enough money to justify the time they consumed. The technical challenges of animation work multiplied when attempted on limited budgets with outdated equipment. Rendering complex scenes could take hours on my second-hand computer, during which I couldn't work on anything else but also couldn't afford to be completely unproductive. I would use those waiting periods to sketch new character designs, research storytelling techniques, or handle administrative tasks for client projects, but the constant multitasking meant that nothing ever received my complete attention. Client work began to feel like emotional labor that extended far beyond the creative tasks I was hired to complete. Brides would call crying about wedding disasters and expect me to provide therapeutic support along with design revisions. Small business owners would share personal financial struggles while requesting additional work that stretched my own budget to accommodate their timeline needs. Corporate clients would demand multiple revision rounds that tripled the time required for projects without increasing the payment, leaving me to choose between maintaining professional relationships and protecting my own financial interests. The physical toll of maintaining an 18-hour work schedule while caring for an energetic 6-year-old was accumulating in ways that concerned me but that I couldn't address without disrupting the delicate balance that kept our life functioning. Chronic back pain from hours spent hunched over drawing tablets competed with wrist strain from repetitive animation work and neck tension from constantly switching between computer screens and Emma's eye-level conversations. Sleep deprivation was beginning to affect my immune system, making me susceptible to every cold virus that circulated through Emma's elementary school. Grocery shopping became an exercise in creative problem-solving that would have impressed mathematicians. I would calculate cost per serving while considering nutritional value and Emma's preferences, all while mentally allocating money between household necessities and professional supplies. The art supply budget competed directly with the grocery budget, creating meal planning challenges that required maximizing nutrition while minimizing cost so that animation materials remained affordable. Emma's school events highlighted the gap between our family's resources and those of her classmates in ways that were both heartbreaking and motivating. Science fair projects were limited by our supply budget, while other children arrived with elaborate displays that clearly represented significant parental investment. Field trip fees required careful planning that sometimes meant declining opportunities that would have enriched Emma's education. The contrast wasn't lost on me, but explaining it to a 6-year-old without making her feel deprived required careful emotional navigation. The software subscriptions that enabled professional quality animation work consumed a significant portion of our monthly budget, creating ongoing tension between artistic ambition and practical necessity. Every month, I had to choose between maintaining access to animation programs and upgrading other aspects of our life that Emma was beginning to notice needed attention. Our internet connection was barely adequate for large file uploads, our furniture was showing wear that couldn't be hidden with creative arrangement, and Emma's clothes were increasingly composed of hand-me-downs from Jessica's friends, whose children had outgrown items we couldn't afford to buy new. Professional development opportunities were limited by both financial constraints and time availability. Animation conferences required registration fees, travel expenses, and childcare arrangements that pushed them far beyond our budget. Online workshops could be accessed during Emma's sleep hours, but the exhaustion from maintaining regular work schedules made it difficult to absorb new information effectively. The isolation from industry trends and networking opportunities created a sense of falling behind that competed with the pride I felt in developing Luna's world independently. The emotional weight of constant rejection from animation studios was beginning to affect my confidence in ways that extended beyond professional disappointment. Each form letter declining my submissions felt like personal judgment about the value of stories I had spent months crafting with love and attention to detail. The feedback was always too generic to guide improvements but specific enough to suggest that my vision didn't align with market demands, leaving me to question whether the problem was commercial viability or artistic merit. Emma's innocent enthusiasm for Luna's adventures provided both motivation and heartbreak during difficult periods. Her genuine excitement about new character developments reminded me why the stories mattered, but her disappointment when I was too exhausted to create new episodes highlighted the cost of pursuing dreams that demanded more energy than one person could sustainably provide. Balancing her needs for attention and engagement with my own needs for creative expression required constant recalibration that left me feeling inadequate in both roles. The loneliness of working from home was compounded by the isolation of pursuing a career that most people didn't understand. Neighbors would ask what I did for work, and explaining animation always led to conversations about Disney movies and questions about whether I had met famous cartoon characters. The gap between their perception of animation as entertainment and my experience of it as serious artistic expression made casual social interactions feel like translation exercises that required more energy than I could spare. Dating was theoretically possible but practically impossible when every evening was devoted to either client work or animation projects. The few attempts I made at romantic relationships revealed how thoroughly my life had been organized around creative pursuits that potential partners couldn't understand or appreciate. Men who initially seemed attracted to my artistic ambitions quickly became frustrated with the time and attention that those ambitions demanded, leaving me to choose between compromise that felt like betrayal and loneliness that felt like failure. My family's offers of help always came with conditions that made acceptance feel like admission of defeat. Linda would offer to babysit Emma while I focused on building a real client base, meaning graphic design work that paid better than animation projects. Robert would suggest business strategies that required abandoning creative pursuits in favor of more commercially viable services. Jessica would research job opportunities that offered traditional benefits, but would require relocating to cities where animation work was more readily available, but where we couldn't afford to live. The gap between my artistic vision and my technical abilities created ongoing frustration that required constant learning during hours when I was already exhausted from other responsibilities. Animation techniques that looked effortless in professional productions required skills that I was developing through online tutorials watched at midnight after Emma was asleep. Character rigging, background painting, and sound design were all skills I needed to master independently because hiring specialists wasn't financially feasible. Equipment failures felt like catastrophic events that threatened both immediate deadlines and long-term creative goals. When my drawing tablet malfunctioned during a crucial client deadline, the replacement cost competed directly with Emma's upcoming birthday party budget. When my computer crashed during a particularly complex animation sequence, the lost work represented weeks of progress that couldn't be recovered and would have to be recreated during hours I had already allocated to other projects. The mental energy required to maintain optimism while facing constant practical challenges was perhaps the most exhausting aspect of pursuing creative dreams as a single mother. Emma needed a mother who could engage with her enthusiasm and support her own artistic development without transferring the stress and disappointment that colored my professional struggles. Maintaining that emotional separation required acting skills that would have impressed theater directors, presenting confidence and joy while internally questioning whether my artistic pursuits were sustainable or selfish. Client relationships required diplomatic navigation when project requirements conflicted with artistic integrity or financial necessity. Explaining why certain design choices wouldn't work required technical knowledge and communication skills that extended far beyond creative abilities. Managing expectations while protecting my own interests meant learning business skills that hadn't been covered in art school and that competed with creative development for my limited time and mental energy. The seasonal fluctuations in client work created feast-or-famine cycles that made long-term planning nearly impossible. Wedding season brought months of intensive work that provided financial stability but left no time for animation projects. Post-holiday periods brought client droughts that created budget stress but offered opportunities to focus on Luna's development. Balancing these cycles while maintaining Emma's routine required flexibility that was emotionally and logistically exhausting. Social media became a necessary but soul-crushing aspect of building a creative career in the digital age. Maintaining professional online presence required time and energy that could have been spent on actual creative work, but potential clients expected to see active social media engagement before considering hiring decisions. The contrast between my carefully curated online professional image and the reality of working 18-hour days in a converted garage highlighted the gap between perception and reality in creative careers. The administrative aspects of freelance work consumed hours that could have been spent on creative projects but were essential for maintaining the client base that funded our life. Invoicing, tax preparation, contract negotiation, and project management were all skills I had to develop independently while managing the creative work that was supposedly my primary focus. The irony of spending more time managing the business of creativity than actually creating wasn't lost on me, but addressing it would have required hiring help that wasn't financially feasible. Emma's awareness of our financial constraints was carefully managed to preserve her childhood innocence while teaching her the value of money and creative work. She understood that we made different choices than other families because Mama's work was different, but she didn't understand the full scope of sacrifices that those choices required. Explaining why we couldn't afford certain activities or purchases without making her feel deprived required constant emotional calibration that was exhausting in its own right. The health insurance gap that came with freelance work created ongoing anxiety about medical emergencies that could bankrupt our carefully maintained financial balance. Emma's routine pediatric care was budgeted months in advance, but unexpected illnesses or injuries could derail both our finances and my work schedule in ways that would take months to recover from. The stress of operating without a safety net affected every decision about risk-taking, from playground activities to travel opportunities that other families took for granted. Professional isolation was compounded by the geographic reality of living in Phoenix, where animation industry connections were limited and networking opportunities were scarce. The community of freelance designers was supportive but focused primarily on commercial work that paid bills rather than artistic projects that fed souls. Finding mentors or collaborators who understood both the technical and creative challenges of animation required online relationships that provided intellectual connection but couldn't address the loneliness of working alone in a converted garage. The seasonal Arizona heat created additional challenges for maintaining a productive workspace in a garage that wasn't designed for year-round occupancy. Summer months required careful timing of intensive computer work to avoid overheating equipment, and the electricity costs of cooling the space competed with other budget priorities. Winter months brought blessed relief but also highlighted how isolated the workspace was from the main living areas where Emma spent her time. Equipment maintenance and upgrades required technical knowledge that I was developing through necessity rather than training. Learning to troubleshoot computer problems, optimize software performance, and maintain drawing tablets added another layer of responsibility to an already overwhelming list of skills required for creative success. The time spent on technical problem solving was time not spent on actual creative work, but ignoring technical issues could result in equipment failures that would halt all productivity. The emotional labor of maintaining enthusiasm for client projects that didn't align with my artistic vision was perhaps the most draining aspect of balancing commercial and creative work. Designing marketing materials for businesses I didn't believe in required manufacturing enthusiasm that felt increasingly hollow. The contrast between the joy I felt while working on Luna's adventures and the mechanical satisfaction of completing commercial projects highlighted how much emotional energy was being diverted from work that truly mattered to me. By Emma's 6th birthday, the invisible struggle had become a way of life that felt both unsustainable and necessary. The physical exhaustion, financial stress, social isolation, and emotional labor required to maintain our unconventional lifestyle was accumulating in ways that concerned me but that I couldn't address without potentially abandoning the creative dreams that gave meaning to all the sacrifice. The birthday party that I had planned as a celebration of Emma's growth would instead become the catalyst for examining whether the struggle was leading somewhere worthwhile or simply perpetuating a cycle of artistic martyrdom that served no one's best interests. The afternoon that began with hope for family connection and validation would end with the clear realization that the invisible struggle I had been enduring was invisible by choice rather than necessity. My family's mockery would reveal that they had never bothered to look closely enough to see what I was building, and their blindness would finally free me from the exhausting effort of trying to make them understand something they had already decided was worthless. The struggle would continue, but it would no longer be invisible or apologetic. It would be fierce, focused, and fueled by the clarity that comes from finally understanding that some people will never see your vision, and their blindness is their loss, not your failure. The birthday party was supposed to be simple. Emma had been planning it for weeks, carefully selecting which Luna drawings to show her grandparents and aunt, practicing the stories she wanted to tell about each character's adventures. She had asked if she could set up a little exhibition in Grandma Linda's living room, displaying her artwork alongside some of the animation frames I had printed out as examples of how her drawings inspired Luna's world. Her excitement was infectious, and for the first time in months, I allowed myself to hope that maybe this would be the day my family finally understood what we were creating together. The house in Scottsdale looked the same as always, perfectly appointed with furniture that whispered expensive taste and walls that showcased Jessica's professional achievements in elegant frames. Emma bounced out of our modest Honda with her art portfolio clutched against her chest, chattering about which stories she would tell first and whether Grandpa Robert would want to try drawing his own character. Her enthusiasm filled the air between us as we walked up the pristine driveway, and I found myself believing that maybe today would be different. Linda opened the door with the smile she reserved for Emma, warm and genuine in ways that never quite extended to our interactions about my career choices. She swept Emma into a hug that lifted her feet off the ground while I carried the gift bags and art supplies inside, noting the way the house smelled like expensive candles and the kind of domestic perfection that came from having disposable income and no creative chaos cluttering every available surface. Jessica was already there, positioned in the living room with her phone in hand and that particular look of polite attention she wore during family gatherings when topics strayed from business or real estate. She hugged Emma with genuine affection, complimented her birthday dress, and asked about school with the kind of engaged interest that made me remember why I had always wanted her approval. But when Emma started unpacking her art portfolio, I noticed Jessica's eyes drifting toward her phone screen, even as she maintained the appearance of listening. Robert emerged from the kitchen carrying a cake that was clearly store-bought but expensive, the kind with pristine frosting roses that Emma would admire but never eat because they looked too perfect to destroy. He was genuinely pleased to see Emma, asking about her favorite subjects in school and whether she was excited about summer vacation, but I could see him mentally calculating the cost of the art supplies she was arranging on the coffee table with ceremonial precision. Emma began her presentation with the confidence of someone who had never experienced artistic rejection, spreading her drawings across the coffee table while explaining the backstory of each character with elaborate detail. She showed them Luna's companion creatures, the magical objects that appeared in different episodes, and the maps she had drawn of the various worlds Luna explored during her adventures. Her passion was evident in every gesture, every carefully chosen word, every proud smile as she revealed another layer of the creative universe we had built together. The first signs of trouble came not from what my family said, but from what they didn't say. The polite smiles remained fixed, But the genuine interest that had characterized Emma's birthday greetings began to fade as she continued her presentation. Linda made appropriate noises of appreciation, but I could see her glancing toward the kitchen as if mentally calculating when dinner should be served. Robert nodded at regular intervals, but his attention kept drifting toward the television where a golf tournament was playing on mute. Jessica's response was perhaps the most painful, because it was wrapped in the appearance of engagement. She asked questions that demonstrated she had been listening, but the questions felt perfunctory rather than curious, the conversational equivalent of checking items off a list rather than exploring territory that genuinely interested her. When Emma showed her the character designs for Luna's magical pets, Jessica's response was to ask whether Emma might also be interested in more realistic art forms like photography or painting from life. The moment that crystallized everything happened when Emma proudly displayed her latest creation, a detailed drawing of Luna's workshop, where magical objects were repaired and restored. She had spent hours on the tiny details, carefully rendering tools that sparkled with enchantment and shelves lined with mysterious containers that held everything from liquid starlight to crystallized laughter. Her explanation of how the workshop functioned in Luna's world was elaborate and thoughtful, demonstrating the kind of world-building imagination that I recognized as genuinely special. Robert looked at the drawing for exactly 3 seconds before glancing at Jessica with an expression I had seen countless times during my own presentations of creative work. It was the look that preceded gentle but firm redirection toward more practical topics, the visual equivalent of clearing one's throat before changing the subject. But instead of changing the subject, he did something worse. He laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter, exactly. It was the kind of indulgent chuckling that adults reserve for children's imaginary friends, or elaborate explanations of how Santa Claus manages to visit every house in one night. It was laughter that said, "Isn't that cute?" while meaning, "Isn't that ridiculous?" And in that moment, as Robert's laughter filled the perfectly appointed living room, I watched Emma's face transform from pride to confusion to the beginning of hurt that she didn't yet understand. Linda joined the laughter, but hers carried an edge that felt more pointed. "She certainly has quite an imagination," she said, the emphasis on imagination, making it clear that this was not necessarily a positive trait. "I wonder where she gets that from." The look she directed at me was meaningful in ways that Emma couldn't interpret but that landed like a physical blow to my chest. Jessica's contribution was the most devastating, because it came wrapped in apparent kindness. She leaned forward with the expression of someone about to offer helpful guidance, placing her hand gently on Emma's shoulder as she spoke. "You know, sweetheart, these drawings are very creative, but as you get older you might want to try drawing things that actually exist. Real animals, real places, real people. That's how you develop real artistic skills." The word "real" was repeated like an incantation designed to banish the magical worlds that Emma had spent months creating. Real animals instead of dragon companions. Real places instead of enchanted workshops. Real people instead of characters who could see magic in ordinary objects. With each repetition, I watched Emma's excitement deflate like a balloon with a slow leak, her confident posture shifting to uncertainty as she looked between her drawings and the faces of adults she had expected to share her enthusiasm. But the moment that would replay in my mind for months afterward came when Robert, emboldened by the group dynamic that had formed around gentle mockery disguised as concern, reached across the coffee table and picked up one of Emma's drawings. He held it at arm's length, studying it with exaggerated seriousness before turning to Jessica with a grin that made my stomach clench with anticipation of whatever was coming next. "Look familiar?" he asked, waving the drawing in Jessica's direction. "Looks like Emma inherited your sister's fantasy gene. Maybe she can help Maya with her little cartoon business when she grows up." The laughter that followed was louder this time, more confident, as if Robert's joke had given everyone permission to stop pretending that Emma's artistic enthusiasm was anything other than amusing evidence of genetic impracticality. Jessica's response was to pick up another drawing, holding it beside the first one, while shaking her head with fond exasperation. "They're definitely related," she said, her tone carrying the affectionate condescension usually reserved for pets who had learned amusing but useless tricks. "Both living in complete fantasyland. At least Emma's young enough that she'll probably grow out of it. Linda's contribution to the moment was to suggest that perhaps Emma might benefit from more structured activities that would help her develop practical skills alongside her creative interests. Art is wonderful as a hobby, she said, using the tone of voice typically employed when explaining complex concepts to small children. But it's important to learn about the real world too. Maybe we should look into some nice science camps for the summer, or computer classes that teach practical skills. The assault on Emma's creative world was systematic and thorough, each adult contributing their own version of well-meaning guidance that collectively dismantled everything she had excitedly shared with them. Her magical workshop became evidence of impractical thinking. Her character development was dismissed as cute but ultimately pointless. Her elaborate world-building was reframed as a phase to be grown out of, rather than a talent to be nurtured. I sat frozen during this entire exchange, watching my daughter's face cycle through confusion, hurt, and finally the kind of resigned disappointment that children develop when they realize that adults don't always mean what they say about encouraging creativity and imagination. Emma began quietly gathering her drawings, her movements careful and subdued in ways that broke my heart, while simultaneously igniting a fury I hadn't known I was capable of feeling. The conversation moved on with the casual efficiency that families employ when transitioning away from uncomfortable topics. Robert turned up the volume on the golf tournament, Linda disappeared into the kitchen to check on dinner preparations, and Jessica returned her attention to her phone with the satisfied air of someone who had successfully redirected a conversation toward more appropriate subjects. Only Emma and I remained focused on the art supplies being slowly packed away. The creative presentation that had begun with such joy now reduced to evidence of impractical thinking that needed gentle but firm correction. But as I watched Emma carefully placing her drawings back into her portfolio, something shifted inside me that felt like tectonic plates moving after years of pressure. The laughter at her expense, the casual dismissal of work she had created with love and dedication, the systematic destruction of her confidence in the magical worlds we had built together. It was happening to her exactly as it had happened to me for decades, and I realized with crystalline clarity that I was watching the beginning of a pattern that would define her relationship with creativity for the rest of her life, unless I did something to stop it. The moment of decision came when Emma looked up at me with eyes that held questions she was too young to articulate, but too smart not to feel. Why didn't they like her drawings? Why were they laughing at something she had worked so hard on? Why did the adults who claimed to love her seem to think her imagination was something to be corrected rather than celebrated? In her expression, I saw the beginning of the self-doubt that had plagued my own creative development, the slow erosion of confidence that would teach her to hide her artistic impulses rather than share them with pride. I stood up from the couch with movements that felt deliberately slow, as if I were rising from deep water where sound had been muffled and time had moved differently. The room came into sharp focus as I looked around at my family members, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time as people who genuinely could not recognize artistic vision when it was presented to them with love and vulnerability. They weren't cruel people, but they were people whose worldview had no space for the kind of magic that Emma and I created together, and their inability to see beauty in her work said everything about their limitations and nothing about the value of what she had shared. Emma was still holding one of her drawings when I reached for her hand, a picture of Luna discovering that ordinary garden stones were actually sleeping fairy eggs that would hatch into helpful spirits when treated with kindness and patience. The detail in the drawing was remarkable for a 6-year-old, showing not just technical skill but genuine storytelling ability in the way she had captured Luna's expression of wonder and gentle care. It was exactly the kind of imagination that should be nurtured and celebrated, not dismissed as evidence of impractical thinking. I helped Emma finish packing her art supplies, while the adults continued their conversations about more appropriate topics, their voices creating a background buzz that sounded increasingly foreign to my ears. The birthday celebration continued around us with cake cutting and present opening, but I found myself observing it all from a strange emotional distance, as if I were watching actors perform roles in a play that no longer held my interest. The presents that followed were predictably practical: educational games that emphasized math and science skills, books about real animals and actual historical events, art supplies that were specifically designated for realistic drawing rather than fantasy character development. Each gift came with explanations about its educational value and its potential to help Emma develop skills that would be useful in the real world. That word again used like a weapon against imagination and creativity. Emma accepted each present with the polite gratitude that children learn to perform when adults give them things that are supposed to be good for them, but that don't actually bring joy. She said thank you appropriately, admired the educational value of each gift with performed enthusiasm, and carefully arranged everything in neat piles that demonstrated proper appreciation for the thought and expense that had gone into choosing items designed to redirect her interests toward more practical pursuits. The drive home was quiet in ways that felt heavy with unspoken understanding. Emma sat in her car seat, clutching her portfolio of drawings, occasionally looking through them with an expression that seemed to be checking whether they were still as magical as she had believed them to be before sharing them with adults who couldn't see their value. Her silence wasn't petulant or angry. It was the thoughtful quiet of someone processing information that challenged everything she had previously believed about how the world worked. When we arrived at our apartment, Emma went directly to her room without being asked, carrying her art supplies and new educational gifts with equal care but markedly different enthusiasm. I could hear her moving around quietly, putting things away with the subdued efficiency of someone whose excitement had been systematically deflated over the course of an afternoon. The contrast between her morning anticipation and evening resignation was stark enough to make my chest feel tight with protective fury. I sat in the converted garage studio surrounded by months of work on Luna's adventures, looking at character designs and storyboards with new eyes that had been opened by watching my family dismiss Emma's creativity with such casual thoroughness. Every frame of animation represented hours of work that my family saw as elaborate procrastination rather than artistic development. Every story arc I had carefully crafted was viewed as evidence of impractical thinking, rather than genuine talent for narrative construction. The computer screen displayed the latest episode one had been working on, a story about Luna learning that sometimes adults couldn't see magic even when it was right in front of them, and that this blindness was their limitation, rather than evidence that magic didn't exist. The irony of having created this storyline weeks before experiencing its real-world application wasn't lost on me, but it also crystallized something that had been building in my consciousness for months, without reaching full articulation. My family's inability to see value in Emma's artwork or my animation projects wasn't a reflection of the work's quality or commercial potential. It was a reflection of their own limitations, their inability to recognize artistic vision that didn't conform to their narrow definitions of practical value. Emma's drawings were genuinely talented and imaginative. Luna's Adventures was professionally executed and emotionally resonant. The problem wasn't with our creative work. The problem was with an audience that couldn't appreciate what we were offering. The realization felt like opening a door that had been locked for so long I had forgotten it existed. For years, I had been trying to prove to my family that my artistic pursuits were worthy of respect and support, approaching each family gathering like a job interview where I had to demonstrate the practical value of creative work. But watching them dismiss Emma's innocent artistic enthusiasm with such systematic thoroughness made me understand that some people simply cannot see beauty in forms they don't understand. And their blindness is not something that can be cured with better explanations or more impressive achievements. That night, after Emma had fallen asleep clutching one of her Luna drawings like a talisman against the day's disappointments, I returned to my studio with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since college. The work I was doing mattered not because my family approved of it, or because it fit their definitions of practical career development, but because it brought magic into the world in ways that touched people who were capable of seeing that magic. Emma's joy in Luna's Adventures was proof enough of the work's value, and my family's inability to share that joy was their loss rather than my failure. I spent the next 6 hours working on Luna's Adventures with focus that felt laser-sharp, adding details to character animations and refining story elements, with the kind of passionate attention that comes from finally understanding that the work itself is its own justification. Every brushstroke felt deliberate, every story choice felt intentional, and every moment of creative flow felt like reclaiming territory that I had been defending unsuccessfully for years, by trying to explain its value to people who would never understand it. The sun was rising when I finally saved my work and prepared for bed, but the exhaustion I felt was different from the depleting fatigue that had characterized recent months. This was the satisfied tiredness of meaningful work completed with full attention, the kind of creative exhaustion that replenishes the soul even as it taxes the body. For the first time in years, I had worked on Luna's adventures without mentally calculating whether the time spent would somehow translate to family approval or commercial success. I had worked purely for the joy of creation and the satisfaction of bringing imaginary worlds to life with technical skill and artistic vision. Emma's birthday had begun with hope for connection and validation from family members whose approval I had been seeking for most of my adult life. It ended with the clear understanding that their approval was not necessary for the work to have value, and that seeking it had been diverting energy that could be better spent on actual creative development. Their laughter at Emma's artistic enthusiasm had revealed the poverty of their own imagination rather than any deficiency in her creative vision, and their inability to see magic in her drawings was their limitation rather than her mistake. 18 months later, when Disney called with an offer to acquire Dreamweaver Animation Studios and hire me as creative director for a new division focused on imaginative children's content that celebrated creativity and wonder, I would remember this birthday afternoon as the moment when I stopped seeking permission to create and started trusting my own artistic vision. But on that quiet morning after Emma's 6th birthday, as I finally went to bed with paint under my fingernails and stories in my head, I simply felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had finally stopped apologizing for being exactly who she was meant to be. The empty gift box moment hadn't come wrapped in gold foil paper like Nina's story. It came wrapped in family laughter that dismissed everything Emma and I had created together. But the lesson was the same. When people hand you emptiness disguised as concern, they're not protecting you from disappointment. They're revealing their own inability to see the magic you're creating, and that blindness gives you permission to stop seeking their approval and start trusting your own vision. Emma's 6th birthday taught me that some people will never see your work clearly, and their blindness says everything about their limitations and nothing about the value of what you're building in the quiet hours when nobody else is watching. The morning after Emma's birthday, I woke up with a strange sense of lightness that I hadn't felt in years. The familiar weight of seeking approval had lifted sometime during the night, replaced by something that felt like freedom wrapped in determination. Emma was still sleeping, her Luna drawing tucked under her pillow like a shield against anyone who might try to convince her that magic wasn't real. Looking at her peaceful face, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done explaining myself to people who would never understand the work I was doing. The studio felt different that morning, charged with possibility in ways that made every surface seem to hum with creative potential. The character designs that had looked like amateur sketches through my family's eyes now appeared exactly as they were, professional quality artwork that demonstrated genuine talent and commercial viability. Luna's Adventures wasn't a hobby project that distracted from real work. It was the foundation of everything that would follow, the laboratory where I had developed skills and vision that set my work apart from generic commercial animation. I spent the next week systematically documenting everything I had created for Luna's world. Character profiles, story arcs, world-building details, animation sequences, and technical specifications were organized with the precision of someone preparing for battle rather than someone playing with cartoon characters. The portfolio that emerged from this process was substantial enough to fill multiple binders and demonstrated the kind of creative development that animation studios spent millions of dollars trying to achieve through committee brainstorming and market research. Emma's reaction to my renewed focus on Luna's Adventures was immediate and transformative. She could sense that something had shifted in my approach to the work, that the apologetic undertone that had previously colored our creative sessions had been replaced by confident enthusiasm. Her own artistic energy seemed to expand in response, and she began creating new characters and storylines, with the fearless imagination of someone who had been reminded that her creativity was valuable rather than something to be outgrown. The technical improvements I made to Luna's Adventures during those focused weeks were dramatic enough to surprise even me. Working without the mental distraction of seeking family approval allowed me to concentrate fully on storytelling techniques, character development, and animation quality that had been compromised by divided attention. The episodes I completed during this period were markedly superior to earlier work, demonstrating what became possible when creative energy wasn't being diverted into emotional labor designed to convince skeptics of art's value. Client work began to feel less like survival strategy and more like skill-building exercise that funded my real creative development. The graphic design projects that had previously felt like betrayals of artistic integrity now seemed like valuable training in commercial communication and technical proficiency that made my animation work more sophisticated. Every logo design taught me something about visual impact, every marketing campaign developed my understanding of audience psychology, and every client interaction refined my ability to translate creative vision into language that practical people could understand and value. The financial anxiety that had characterized my freelance career began to ease as I stopped viewing commercial work and artistic projects as competing priorities. Luna's Adventures wasn't stealing time from income-generating activities. It was the creative foundation that made my commercial work distinctive and valuable. Clients began hiring me not just for technical competence, but for the imaginative approach that came from spending evenings developing magical worlds and complex characters. My approach to family interactions shifted dramatically once I stopped seeking their validation for my creative choices. Instead of presenting updates about my work as if they were job interviews where approval was required, I began sharing information with the casual confidence of someone reporting objective facts rather than defending controversial decisions. This change in tone seemed to confuse my family initially, as if they weren't sure how to respond to creative updates that weren't presented as requests for permission or understanding. Emma's relationship with her own creativity flourished in the new environment where artistic work was treated as valuable rather than concerning. She began creating elaborate story cycles that connected multiple characters across different adventures, demonstrating narrative sophistication that would have impressed professional writers. Her technical skills improved rapidly when she wasn't receiving mixed messages about whether artistic development was worth pursuing, and her confidence in sharing creative work with others returned to its natural state of generous enthusiasm. The isolation that had previously felt like punishment for choosing an unconventional career path began to feel like sanctuary, where real work could happen without interruption. The converted garage studio became a creative laboratory, where experiments could fail without judgment, and successes could be celebrated without explanation. Working alone meant working at full capacity, without the emotional energy drain that came from constantly translating artistic vision into language that skeptics might find acceptable. Professional development opportunities that had seemed financially impossible became accessible when I stopped viewing them as luxury expenses that competed with practical necessities. Online animation courses were investments in skill development that would improve both commercial work and personal projects. Software upgrades were professional tools that increased productivity rather than indulgences that diverted money from more important uses. The shift in perspective transformed every artistic expense from guilty splurge to strategic business decision. Social media presence that had previously felt like performative necessity began serving genuine professional purposes once I started posting work that demonstrated actual capabilities rather than seeking approval for creative choices. Animation sequences from Luna's Adventures attracted attention from other creators who recognized technical skill and artistic vision when they saw it. The online animation community proved to be far more supportive and knowledgeable than local acquaintances who measured success exclusively in terms of traditional employment benefits. The summer after Emma's 6th birthday brought a creative breakthrough that felt like discovering a new dimension of artistic possibility. Working without the psychological burden of family skepticism allowed me to push Luna's Adventures in directions that were more emotionally complex and visually sophisticated than anything I had previously attempted. The characters developed psychological depth that rivaled professional animated series, and the world-building reached levels of detail that created rich environments for storytelling that could sustain multiple seasons of content. Emma's involvement in Luna's creative development became more sophisticated as her own artistic skills advanced and her confidence in sharing ideas grew. She began contributing story concepts that demonstrated genuine understanding of character motivation and narrative structure, proving that her artistic enthusiasm was matched by developing technical ability that would serve her well regardless of whatever career path she eventually chose to pursue. Client relationships improved dramatically once I stopped apologizing for the creative approach that made my work distinctive. Business owners who had initially hired me for basic graphic design services began requesting more complex projects that utilized the imaginative problem-solving skills I had developed through animation work. The premium rates I could charge for creative solutions that went beyond standard design services made Luna's Adventures financially sustainable rather than economically threatening. Equipment upgrades that had previously required months of careful saving became possible as my income increased and my confidence in the work's value grew. Professional quality animation software, high-resolution monitors, and precision drawing tablets transformed the studio into a facility capable of producing content that met industry standards. The improved tools enabled technical achievements that would have been impossible with the second-hand equipment I had been using during the years when every artistic expense required justification. The fall brought opportunities that would have seemed fantastical during the period when I was seeking family approval for creative choices. Animation industry professionals who had discovered my work through social media began reaching out with collaboration proposals and consulting opportunities. The reputation I was building within the creative community opened doors to projects that paid well, while allowing me to develop skills and connections that supported long-term artistic goals. Emma started second grade with the quiet confidence of someone whose creative interests had been validated, rather than redirected toward more practical pursuits. Her teacher noticed immediately that she approached assignments with unusual imagination and technical skill, often incorporating storytelling elements that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of character development and narrative structure. The artistic foundation we had built together was serving her well in academic contexts, proving that creativity and practical success were complementary rather than competing priorities. Holiday family gatherings became exercises in polite disengagement rather than opportunities to seek understanding that would never be offered. I answered questions about my work with brief, factual responses that didn't invite debate or require defense. Emma shared her latest artistic achievements with family members who couldn't appreciate them, but she no longer seemed to expect or need their approval. We had found our audience among people who could recognize and celebrate the magic we were creating together. Winter brought the kind of focused creative productivity that becomes possible when mental energy isn't being diverted into emotional labor designed to convince skeptics of art's value. Luna's Adventures expanded into a comprehensive universe, with multiple character storylines, elaborate world-building details, and animation sequences that demonstrated professional-level technical achievement. The work I completed during those months represented years of creative development, condensed into a period of laser-focused artistic intensity. Emma's 7th birthday was celebrated with a small party that included friends from school who appreciated her artistic talents and encouraged her creative enthusiasms. The contrast with the previous year's family gathering was stark enough to highlight how much our lives had improved once we stopped seeking approval from people who couldn't see the value in what we were creating. Emma glowed with confidence as she shared her latest Luna drawings with children who responded with genuine excitement and admiration. Spring arrived with animation work that felt effortless in ways that surprised me daily. Characters moved with fluid grace, storylines developed with organic inevitability, and technical challenges that had previously required hours of research and experimentation were solved with intuitive confidence. The creative momentum that built during months of working without external validation had reached a level where artistic vision and technical execution were perfectly aligned. The portfolio of work I had accumulated by Emma's 7th birthday represented a body of creative achievement that would have been impossible to produce while seeking approval from people who couldn't recognize artistic excellence when it was presented to them. Luna's Adventures had evolved into a complete animated universe with enough content to fill multiple seasons of professional television programming. The technical quality met industry standards. The storytelling demonstrated sophisticated understanding of character development and narrative structure, and the visual design created rich environments that supported complex emotional themes. Emma's artistic development during that transformative year proved that children flourish when their creative interests are treated as valuable rather than concerning. Her drawing skills had advanced to levels that impressed art teachers. Her storytelling abilities demonstrated genuine narrative sophistication, and her confidence in sharing creative work with others had returned to its natural state of generous enthusiasm. The foundation we had built together would serve her well regardless of whatever career paths she eventually chose to pursue. The social media following I had built by sharing Luna's adventures without apology had grown to include animation industry professionals, children's content creators, and families who appreciated imaginative storytelling that celebrated creativity and wonder. The online community proved to be far more supportive and knowledgeable than local acquaintances who measured success exclusively in terms of traditional employment benefits and practical career advancement. Professional opportunities that had seemed impossible during the years of seeking family validation began appearing with increasing frequency as my reputation within the animation community grew. Consulting projects, collaboration proposals, and speaking opportunities proved that there was substantial commercial demand for the kind of imaginative content I had been developing in my converted garage studio, while my family worried about my impractical career choices. The phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning in late spring, 18 months after Emma's 6th birthday party. Michael Torres introduced himself as a creative development executive from Disney Animation Studios, explaining that he had discovered Luna's adventures through social media posts that had been shared widely within the children's entertainment industry. His voice carried the kind of professional enthusiasm that immediately distinguished genuine interest from polite inquiry. The conversation that followed felt surreal in its simplicity. Michael explained that Disney was developing a new content division focused on imaginative children's programming that celebrated creativity and wonder in ways that resonated with contemporary families. Luna's adventures represented exactly the kind of original storytelling and artistic vision they were seeking to develop through partnerships with independent creators who had proven their ability to create compelling content without corporate infrastructure. The offer was more comprehensive than anything I could have imagined during the years when my family questioned whether animation work was commercially viable. Disney wanted to acquire Dreamweaver Animation Studios, fund additional episode development, and hire me as creative director for their new imaginative content division. The financial terms were substantial enough to provide long-term security for Emma and me, while supporting the creative work that had always been the real purpose behind everything I had built. Emma's reaction to the news was pure joy, untempered by the practical concerns that would have colored my family's response. She understood immediately that Luna's adventures would reach children around the world who needed stories about seeing magic in ordinary objects and trusting their own creative visions, even when adults couldn't understand them. Her enthusiasm reminded me why the work had always mattered more than external validation or commercial success. The call to my family was brief and factual, delivered with the same tone I had been using for months to report creative achievements that they couldn't appreciate. Linda's response was shocked silence, followed by questions about salary figures and benefit packages. Robert immediately began calculating the investment potential of Disney stock options. Jessica's reaction focused on the professional networking opportunities that would come with working for a major entertainment corporation. None of them asked about the creative aspects of the offer, or expressed curiosity about how Luna's adventures had attracted attention from Disney's development executives. Their responses revealed the same fundamental blindness that had characterized their reaction to Emma's artwork 18 months earlier. But their inability to see the artistic achievement behind the commercial success no longer felt disappointing. It simply confirmed that some people can only recognize value when it's translated into terms they understand, and their limitations were not my responsibility to overcome. Emma's 8th birthday was celebrated with a party that included Disney executives who had flown to Phoenix specifically to meet the little girl whose imagination had inspired Luna's adventures. She shared her latest artwork with animation professionals who recognized genuine talent and encouraged her creative development with the enthusiasm of people who understood that imagination was valuable rather than something to be outgrown. The contrast with previous family gatherings was stark enough to highlight how much our lives had changed once we stopped seeking approval from people who couldn't see magic even when it was presented with professional presentation and commercial validation. The signing ceremony for the Disney acquisition took place in a conference room filled with animation industry professionals who spoke the language of creative vision and artistic achievement with fluent enthusiasm. Emma sat beside me as I signed contracts that would fund Luna's continued development while providing her with educational opportunities and financial security that would support whatever dreams she chose to pursue. The little girl who had been mocked for drawing magical workshops was now sitting in a room full of adults who celebrated imagination as the foundation of successful creative careers. My family's eventual understanding of what had happened came not from recognizing the artistic achievement that preceded the commercial success, but from seeing Disney's financial commitment translated into terms they could comprehend. The house we were able to buy with the acquisition proceeds impressed them in ways that years of creative development never had. Emma's college fund made them proud in ways that her artistic achievements never could. The health insurance and retirement benefits that came with my Disney position earned their approval in ways that the imaginative content that made those benefits possible never would. But by then, their approval felt irrelevant rather than satisfying. The work had always been its own reward, and Emma's joy in seeing Luna's adventures reach children around the world proved that we had been creating something valuable regardless of whether my family could recognize that value. The empty box they had handed us at her 6th birthday party had been filled with magic they couldn't see, and their blindness had been their loss rather than our failure. Looking back now, I understand that the afternoon when my family laughed at Emma's drawings was the moment when I finally stopped seeking permission to create and started trusting my own artistic vision. Their mockery revealed the poverty of their imagination rather than any deficiency in our creative work, and their inability to see magic in Luna's world gave us permission to stop trying to convince them and start focusing entirely on bringing that magic to people who could appreciate it. Emma is 10 now, and she still draws every day with the fearless enthusiasm of someone who learned early that creativity is valuable, even when some people can't see its worth. Luna's Adventures has been translated into 12 languages and reaches millions of children whose parents understand that imagination is the foundation of innovation, rather than evidence of impractical thinking. The converted garage studio has been replaced by professional facilities where Emmy sometimes visits after school to work alongside Disney animators who encourage her artistic development with the same enthusiasm I wish my family had shown for her magical workshop drawings. The greatest gift my family gave us wasn't their eventual pride in my commercial success, but their early dismissal that forced me to stop seeking external validation and start trusting internal creative vision. When people hand you emptiness disguised as practical concern, they're not protecting you from disappointment. They're revealing their own limitations and giving you permission to find an audience that can see the magic you're creating. Emma's 6th birthday taught me that some people will never appreciate your work, and their blindness says everything about their capacity for wonder and nothing about the value of what you're building in the quiet hours when nobody else is watching. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.